Hello, good people. I'm very happy to be back with you today and talking about the second part of the first chapter of Joseph Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity. Now, today we are going to be discussing or beginning the discussion of the Apostles' Creed in earnest. And the first part of the Apostles' Creed in English is I believe, in Latin, credo. And that is what he is going to talk about. It's two words, I and believe, and he's going to just talk about those two words and how we understand those words today. So what he says is that we have a particular historical context that we are living in, and that because of this, we have a historical consciousness, and that has become part of our self-consciousness. And it changes the meaning of what we are saying when we say, I believe. The reason is because we see ourselves, because of our historical context, we see ourselves as being significantly different from the people of the past, the people of other times. We have a different attitude toward reality as a whole, and we are conscious of that attitude. We are conscious of our difference. It's not just something that's in humanity as a whole, but it's something that affects what we mean when we say the word I. So the I of I believe is different from the I that used to say I believe back when the creed was originally written, and Ratzinger thinks this is something that we need to attend to. Then there's the word believe. What does it mean to believe? First he says, quote, that it is by no means self-evident that the kernel of Christianity shall be that it is a belief. He points out that other systems of belief or other religious systems throughout the world and in history did not recognize themselves as a belief. This is something different in Christianity. So, for example, the Jews, if you ask them what it means to be Jewish, they would say it means to follow the law. They see their faith as law. Buddhists see theirs as a certain path that has to be followed. To the ancient Romans, religio was not a set of beliefs, but was a set of customs and the performance of certain sacrifices and rites. They didn't question people as to what they believed about the Roman gods. Very interestingly, just I think it was yesterday, Paul VanderKlay had a video up where he played some videos of Tom Holland being interviewed by a couple of people, and Tom Holland points out that even the concept of having a religion separate from the rest of life or separate from secularity, that in itself was also a Christian idea. So Ratzinger asks, what attitude is really signified by the word believe? And further, how is it that it is becoming so difficult for our individual personal I to enter into this I believe? How is it that again and again it seems almost impossible for us to identify our present-day egos with that I of the I believe, which has been predetermined and shaped by past generations? And he goes a little bit into a digression about the way we look at the past. We tend to think, like we hear phrases like the age of faith talking about the Middle Ages, and we tend to think, well, everybody was a believer back then. And he says, that's not really exactly the way it is. He says, there has always been a great mass of nominal believers, and for them, the faith was really kind of a ready-made mode of life. They were not very introspective about their own beliefs. But he says there was a relatively small number who entered into the inner movement of belief. And that's really what he wants to talk about. What is that inner movement of belief? Well, he says it comes about by the fact that man, the quote, man is fashioned in such a way that his eyes are only capable of seeing what is not God. And thus for man, God is and always will be the essentially invisible something lying outside his field of vision. So this is not merely a statement about God, it's also a statement about man. We live by seeing and grasping, but God does not appear to our sight, to our ordinary sight that we use to live in the world all of the time. And one of the things he says is that this is one of the major Old Testament insights about God, that God is essentially invisible. Quote, God is not just he who at present lies in fact outside the field of vision, but could be seen if it were possible to go farther. No, he is the being who stands essentially outside of it, however far our field of vision may be extended. So, for example, in many of the ancient myths with the gods, you could possibly travel to where the gods were. If you could get to the island where they were, you could get up the mountain where they were not invisible. But the God of the Bible, the God of the Old Testament, is essentially invisible, regardless of how far we extend our vision. So we have extended our vision very far in this time. We use telescopes to see very far out into space, and we know that when we see far out into space, we're actually seeing backwards in time. So our vision extends that way. Our vision extends into the very small. And we also have multiple ways of seeing things. We use different kinds of light waves, different radio frequencies, all kinds of things to scan things and to give us and to make things visible to our sight. But God is not visible in any of those ways. So he goes on to say, quote, credo means that man does not regard seeing, hearing, and touching as the totality of what concerns him, that he does not view the area of his world as marked off by what he can see and touch, but seeks a second mode of access to reality, a mode he calls belief, and in such a way that he finds in it the decisive enlargement of his whole view of the world. It signifies not the observation of this or that fact, but a fundamental mode of behavior toward being. So this mode of, unquote, so this mode of behavior toward being that is represented by belief is the conception that what undergirds the reality that we see is something that we cannot see. In other words, it's something we cannot see makes what we can see possible. And in fact, makes our existence as humans possible. Quote, belief signifies the decision that at the very core of human existence, there is a point that cannot be nourished and supported on the visible and tangible, that encounters and comes into contact with what cannot be seen, and finds that it is a necessity for its own existence, unquote. This is like so many of the conversations that Paul VanderKlay has had with people. It's similar to the conversation that Karen on the Meaning Code channel just had with the man who's a biochemist, of all of the things that he could see finally did not answer to what it was that would undergird reality. So Ratzinger goes on to say, quote, he has to turn around inwardly in order to see how badly he is neglecting his own interests by letting himself be drawn along in this way by his natural inclination. He must turn around to recognize how blind he is if he trusts only what he sees with his eyes. I want to read that again. That's such a key point. This is saying, what is belief? It's this. He has to turn around inwardly in order to see how badly he is neglecting his own interests by letting himself be drawn along in this way by his natural inclination. He must turn around to recognize how blind he is if he trusts only what he sees with his eyes. Belief is not demonstrable. It is an about turn. Only he who turns about is receptive to it, and because our inclination does not cease to point us in another direction, it remains a turn that is new every day. It has always meant a leap out of the tangible world that presses on man from every side. Belief has always had something of an adventurous break or leap about it. Belief was never simply the attitude automatically corresponding to the whole slant of human life. It has always been a decision that in every age demanded a turnabout by man that can only be achieved by an effort of will. Now, I want to talk about these words he's used in these last couple of paragraphs. He's mentioned an inclination. He's mentioned a slant. And this is the idea that there's a direction in which we are naturally bent or prone. We're slanted. We have an inclination. We're tilted towards something. What is the thing we're tilted toward? It is to rely completely upon our vision, upon our physical vision, our physical senses. That is why we have to turn around. Because remember, the God of the Bible, the Christian God that is being proposed here in this introduction to Christianity, is not visible, it's not available to our senses. So this is problem number one. It's the problem of the visible versus the invisible. Now there's a second problem. This is problem number two that Joseph Ratzinger is going to identify and why we have trouble saying I believe. On top of the gulf between visible and invisible, there comes to make things harder for us, the gulf between then and now. So we have two problems. We have the visible versus the invisible, and now we have the problem of then versus now. Why is that a problem? It's because the Christian message is something that has been with us for a couple of thousand years. And it used to be that we felt like tradition was something that we were ensconced in with a certain amount of security to pass it along. But people today don't feel like that. He says, quote, today, tradition appears to be what has been laid aside, the merely out of date, whereas progress is regarded as the real promise of life, so that man feels at home, not in the realm of tradition of the past, but in the realm of progress and the future. So then, the primary stumbling block to belief, the distance between the visible and invisible, is concealed and blocked by a second stumbling block of the then and now. He goes on to say, it is only here that the peculiarity of the specifically Christian scandal becomes visible, because it is concerned with God in history, with God as a man, by thus seeming to bridge the gulf between eternal and temporal, between visible and invisible, by making us meet God as man, the eternal as the temporal as one of us. It understands itself as revelation. John 1:18, he quotes, no one has ever seen God. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. At first glance, this would seem to solve the problem of the invisible God, right? Because now we have God becoming invisible. We have a God in history. He says, at first glance, this really seems to be the disclosure of God. But things are curiously double-sided. What first seems to be a radical revelation is at the same moment the cause of extreme obscurity and concealment. Why? It's because this God who has come into history has drawn so close to us that we can kill him. The fact that we can kill him makes him seem to be no God at all. Then when we look back at human history, we see that the death of this God has stamped human history in a way that cannot be denied. Well, wouldn't that open up that revelation to us? It would, but not for us now, because the Christian claim that God entered human history and changed it by allowing us to kill him in our present consciousness makes him no God at all, because to us, human history no longer matters. Even at the same time that we are so focused on the idea of two things. One, we are a new generation in history. We have progressed beyond the past, and progress in history is our great objective. But at the same time, we have come to view human history itself as a project that is completely futile. Ratzinger says, quote, "Surely a God thus narrowed down to one point is bound to die definitively in a view of the world that remorselessly reduces man and his history to a tiny grain of dust in the cosmos." You see, because we can see such a big universe, we have concluded that we live on a dust mote. We live on the spiral arm of a rather unimpressive spiral galaxy. Surely somewhere in the universe there's some much more Tony neighborhood that we could have been on, but we're over here in like Nowheresville in the galaxy, and what use are we, or what good are we, or what value are we when we look at the great big universe? Even if there were a God who had made it all, he would surely not be visiting our neighborhood. That's the viewpoint that people have. So the progress of human history now bumps up against this sense of meaninglessness of human history, that in the grand scheme of things, we don't mean anything. And so this keeps us from recognizing the value of a God that comes into our history. We have grown beyond the silliness of believing, as they used to do in the past, that we were the center of the universe. It says that was something that we thought of only, quote, only in the naive years of its childhood, of mankind's childhood. So then he says, is it still permissible to believe? Have we not a duty to break with the dream and face reality? That's what people say. Face reality. There's no God. There's no meaning to anything. And then he says, well, should we not ask rather more carefully what the real actually is? See, so now we have to open up the question. The question of God has got to be a question about what is real. And we find that we have answered that question differently at different times. Quote, if by means of the historical knowledge we enjoy today, we survey the road taken by the human spirit so far as it is visible to us, we shall observe that in various periods of this spirit's development, there are various basic attitudes toward reality, the magical, the metaphysical, and finally today, the scientific. So he says, we've had different attitudes toward reality over the times, and as we've gone along, these different attitudes have changed what it means to believe. So what is it that is characteristic of the scientific attitude toward reality that we claim to have now? Well, the characteristic of the scientific attitude is that we are limited to phenomena. We cannot know things in themselves, and we cannot actually, he says, sound the nature of being itself. That is, penetrate into the nature of being itself. That's a fruitless enterprise. So instead, what can be seized on in our measuring grasp, the methodology of natural science, is based on the restriction to phenomena, and it suffices us. We can deal with it and thus create for ourselves a world in which we can live as men. By saying it suffices us, Ratzinger is pointing to the self-satisfaction we feel in the accomplishments of our technology. We have what we need right here with all that we've accomplished. So why would we want to turn around and see if there's any other need? Quote, as a result, a new concept of truth and reality has gradually developed in modern thinking and living, a concept that holds sway for the most part unconsciously. This reminds me of what Paul VanderKlay says about how he recognizes that in his own unconscious, he has a tendency toward materialism. So what does he do? Every year he reads C.S. Lewis's Miracles to get himself out of that tendency, that unconscious tendency he has to slant himself off towards materialism. Thinking, a concept that holds sway for the most part unconsciously as the assumption on which we think and speak, and that can only be overcome if it too is exposed to the test of consciousness. Oops. See, that's where we're going to head, because consciousness itself is going to test our materialistic assumptions. And today, before I made this video, I saw Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Hall on Rebel Wisdom. And what were they talking about? They're talking about consciousness. We've been talking about consciousness over and over again in this space, but actually, I can remember going back a number of years. In the 1960s, it seems suddenly people were talking about consciousness, expanding your consciousness, getting a higher consciousness. All these things about consciousness, all of a sudden, it's like we became very conscious of our own consciousness and analyzing it and trying to figure it out. And where has it gotten us? We have no idea how it is that consciousness actually arises. We don't know how consciousness itself comes to be, or what the role of consciousness is with regard to the reality of the cosmos. So Ratzinger says, at this point, the function of non-scientific thinking becomes perceptible. Aha! We're going to need another kind of thinking besides the scientific, that of considering the unconsidered and bringing the human problems it raises before the gaze of consciousness. So that is going to be the next step in his project. He's going to go into the history of some of the thinking philosophically about about how we got to where we are, kind of like what John Vervaeke did, not quite as long as John Vervaeke, or not anywhere near as long, but he's going to cover several thinkers that he thinks are pivotal in our understanding of reality, and go over them to kind of elucidate how did we get to have the kind of consciousness, have the kind of awareness of our consciousness and the conclusions that we reach today that are making it so hard to say I believe. Now, before I go, I want to talk to you a little bit about what Ratzinger pointed out about this idea that we are just floating around on a little speck of dust in the cosmos, and therefore we are not of any value. Here's what I want you to think about. I want you to consider a blue whale. Now, blue whales are the largest things that have ever lived on the earth, right? A blue whale weighs as much as 1,000 human beings, and it is longer than 2 school buses. It has 100 quadrillion cells. Think about that. So massive. Now here's a question. And anybody who thinks evolutionarily should be able to answer this. Think about that massive beast, a blue whale. What is the most important cell in the blue whale? Well, if it is a female, it is her egg cell. And if it is a male, it is a sperm cell. The entire massive beast, really, that whole body, all those huge organs, its heart is so big that a baby human being could crawl through the valves of its heart. Think how big its heart is. That whole massive beast really lives for one thing, and that is for the support and the achievement of that single cell, that egg cell or that sperm cell. That's what you have to believe if you think evolutionarily, right? Now, think about this. The universe is massive. But if this earth is the place for the germination of God's children, and that is what Christians say it is, then it doesn't matter how out of the way it is. It doesn't matter how small it is. That is irrelevant to its importance. Just like the position within the body of that blue whale and the size in comparison to the body of that egg cell or sperm cell is irrelevant to its importance. So you might call that a kind of a whale of an argument. Okay. The next time that we get back together, we will continue on with the next section of this first chapter of Ratzinger's book. And I will put a link to a Google document with some of the quotations that I used, well, all the quotations that I used in this particular video, so that you can look at them if you want to. And in the meantime, treat yourself as though you were someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible. So am I. Together, we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching.